everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I want to talk a bit about print runs in publishing and how they work, some things to know about them, some misconceptions. And yes, this video was inspired by the fact that I just found out that for the first time in my publishing career, I am going into a second printing. I found out on Thursday. I was like, so my book, The Ivies, has only been out for 2 weeks, but it is selling faster and more than my publisher had anticipated. The faster being the operative word, because we're going to talk about printers and shipping and timing and numbers and some of the factors that go into print runs, and specifically some of the current market conditions affecting print runs. I picked the brain of a separate editor friend of mine, mostly to make sure that I was correct about some of the things I've learned and or assumed about print runs. And she told me some stuff that is a little bit concerning. I mean, don't panic, except to say if you really want a physical copy of The Ivies, maybe buy it sooner rather than later. We'll talk about it. But actually, one of the things that I want to talk about, or the tea to spill kind of, is it can mean a lot of different things. Like, don't automatically assume that because an author gets a second, a third, a fourth printing that they're some runaway bestseller. Because we're going to talk about print runs and print sizes, what's kind of realistic, what to expect, what's a red flag versus what isn't. And like she says, having just celebrated finding out that she's getting a second printing. I am not going to tell you my exact print run number, but I am going to tell you I had a pretty modest but healthy first print run, and finding out that I'm already getting a second printing is really, really great. I'm not talking about like they printed 2,000 copies and now they're printing more. It's more than that. So we're gonna talk about it. And what's really funny to me about the whole print run thing is that we don't normally talk about it for two reasons. One, it's kind of dry. It's kind of boring. You're like, wow, you're really doing an entire video on print runs, but what else do I exist for except not to go into like weird nitty gritty on publishing topics, specifically traditional publishing topics that are a little bit opaque, that you don't normally talk about or think about. I personally don't find it boring, but it's definitely a little bit opaque. Case in point, I, over the years, have just had to flat out ask questions of industry professionals, of my agent, of my various editors about what things mean when it comes to print runs, because I do think it's a little bit of like hand-wavy smoke and mirrors, which is partly on purpose. So let's start off by talking about announced print runs versus actual print runs. And I think this is the first like great smoke and mirrors act that publishing kind of plays on purpose. So let's talk about announced print runs. What is an announced print run? It is the print run that the publisher announces. Usually, this is really kind of an internal thing. You as the consumer rarely are going to hear about a book's print run, but if you pay attention to kind of the trades and resources, you can see. You'll see this often in the trades when they're doing like a preview of upcoming seasons. They might highlight titles and tell you what the announced print run is. You might see this in catalogs. And essentially, this is publishers signaling to distributors and so on how much kind of weight they are putting behind a title. This is their way of announcing, hey, we think this is going to be a big book, so we plan on printing 250,000 copies, 125,000 copies, 75,000 copies. I'd say that's like on the low end of high, but that is the signal that the publisher is giving to people. This is our big book for the season. You should pay attention to this big book and you should order lots of copies, because the other kind of unspoken thing with announced print runs when they are larger is we're putting a lot of marketing support and dollars behind this title. Order this title. Now, so on the author side, my tip here is if you see that there is an announced print run for your book and it seems kind of high, definitely throw yourself a little party, celebrate a little, because it probably means that you're a priority at your publisher. But gird your loins, because the tea is, the secret is, most actual print runs really aren't that big. Very, very rarely is the actual print run as big as announced. usually, yes, say with a bestseller. So if they tell you that they are printing 750,000 copies of Leigh Bardugo's new book, yeah, they're probably printing 750,000 copies of Leigh Bardugo's new book, because there's a reasonable expectation with data to back it up that that title can move that many copies. But certainly with debuts or kind of less tried and true bestsellers, it's just usually not true. So my first book was announced at a print run of 75,000 copies. They did not print 75,000 copies. Just fathoming that is bonkers. But that was their way of signaling to people, this is our big title, you should place a lot of orders. And I got a decent number of orders. And then my real print run, what they actually printed several months before the book went on sale, was more in line with actual orders from bookstores, distributors, and libraries. I mean, essentially distributors. They figure out, ooh, how many copies are people really gonna want of this? And then they try to do the print run accordingly. And there's always this kind of calculation with publishers of, well, it's risk versus reward, it's ROI, return on investment, and kind of, it's all math. And just to give you a little bit of context, so that announced print run was 75,000. They printed fewer than 20,000 copies, around 20,000 copies of the book, which is actually pretty good, but that's not 75,000, is it? So when you see a book, especially a debut, announce that, oh, we're gonna print 250,000 copies, I'd bet you money pretty much that that's not actually true. Often say with a big lead title at a bigger publisher, I was at a smaller publisher, it could be announced at 125 or 250,000 print run, and then they will actually print 50,000 copies and hope, of course, that it sells that much or less. I mean, let's talk about publishers really hedging their bets and some of that arithmetic and the things that factor into it. So the number one thing that a publisher considers, or one of the number one things that a publisher is really going to consider in terms of how big is an actual print run, is that the last thing that they want is something called backstock. And this is a term that my editor friend said to me, and I was like, tell me more. And it's a term for something that I already knew was a thing, and that is, there is only so much space in the warehouses, physical space, where these books end up being kept. And what a publisher always wants to have is they want to have copies moving out of their warehouses at a steady clip. So there's never any large number of copies of a single title just sitting on the shelf collecting dust, because shelf space in a warehouse is uber valuable, and they want to maximize every single inch of space in their warehouse. So they don't want backstock, which is copies that sit in the warehouse and don't move. I mean, worst case, they don't move for a couple months, okay, but a title that's not moving for 6 months, a year, more than that, I mean, more than that is when they will pulp copies. They will literally destroy the books because they're taking up valuable space that other titles could take up instead. And so that's why they don't do massive print runs right out the gate until they see how a title actually performs in the market. And so this is coupled with a couple of other phenomenons. Generally, this has been a thing for a while. Print runs have been decreasing and getting smaller, certainly in YA, but then COVID happened. So we are going to talk about some of the issues of COVID. I find this stuff really, really fascinating. And this is where my friend told me, things are getting bad, and I'm like, oh no. And you're like, what? So I've mentioned it before in videos once or twice. It's kind of a known thing in our little corner of the industry that there are twofold problems happening right now: paper shortages and printer shortages. There were paper shortages before COVID, and paper shortages means the price of paper goes up. So literally the cost of printing each copy of a book has gone up. This also means it's better for books to be shorter because that's less paper. And so there are all of these, complex calculations that go into how much does it actually cost to print a book, how much does it cost to put it out in the world, market it, distribute it, and then how much does it make the publisher back, and there are all those calculations there. And then there's also printer shortages. A lot of printers have gone out of business because of COVID. And so there are just literally fewer places to print books, which means they have really long queues, wait lists for having books printed. There's less paper, it's more expensive. And also when there are fewer competitors in a space, they can also charge more. So those printers are charging more as well. And then the third problem, this is the problem that I It's funny, my friend told me this thing and I was like, oh, I watched a YouTube video on that. I'm gonna link it for you down below so that you can also go, oh. There is literally a problem right now internationally with shipping. There are shipping containers that are just sitting in harbors and can't go out. It's way more complex than that. I'm gonna link you down below to the Wendover Productions video I coincidentally watched weeks ago about this very problem with supply and demand post-pandemic. That goes in quotes because we're not really post, but we're post in the sense that we should be concerned that these supply chains are still disrupted and why. And so my friend said there are literally, because most printing happens in China, there are literally crates and crates and crates of books sitting in shipping containers in China that aren't leaving. They can't get here. And so they're literally running out of book stock for certain titles. And so you're gonna see more disruptions in supply chain disruptions and literally being unable to buy a physical copy of certain titles. My friend said there's a very popular title, people wanna buy it, and it's out of stock because it's sitting in a crate in China. So we're looking at a situation where there's generally a phenomenon. Publishers are doing smaller print runs because it represents both a lower risk and a lower cost. They're waiting to see how titles perform in the market because sales are down across the board, asterisk. Sales are up in the pandemic, but sales are up in the pandemic and post-pandemic for established authors, bestsellers. People are going for comfort reads, people are going for books they know, which is very, very great for all those authors and all those books. Sales are struggling, lagging is the word I will say. Down is a weird term for it, but like lesser known authors, debut authors, just titles that fall into certain kind of genres and feels aren't performing as well because people have also gravitated toward very particular kinds of books, lots of escape reads, lots of beach reads, with everything going on in the world. And so that is to say, especially on debut titles or just untested titles, the print runs just aren't massive. I'm coming back to print runs. Finally, it's perfectly common to see, like on say a YA debut, that the first print run might be 5,000 copies or less because frankly a lot of books don't sell 5,000 copies. So it's not a massive risk to the publisher to print 5,000 copies. And so you might see an author, and it should always be celebrated when you go into multiple printings, but there's a difference between a book that goes into a second printing because the first print run was modest, say 3,000 copies. It's still great that it goes into a second printing versus say a book's first print run was 20,000 copies and they go into a second printing and you won't know what their actual print run was, by the way. I don't even know what most people's print runs are, but it's just kind of funny because you're far more likely to see authors from smaller publishers who can't take the risk on huge print runs, who print much smaller print runs, get second, third, fourth printings, than authors who maybe were bigger books or meant to be bigger books and they had more modest or like small, big print runs, like 20,000 copies is a pretty good print run, getting second, third, etc. printings. So that's just my like kind of warning to you. It's not like it matters, but always take with a grain of salt when you see someone like bragging, because honestly, celebrate, but it's also a humble brag. She says having also posted excitedly about getting a second printing because, I mean, for me, it's like a career dream because my previous two books didn't go into second printings, probably won't go into second printings, though I had a more modest print run for The Stars We Steal, and I've been asked if I'm getting a paperback. I honestly don't know, but I really hope so because like I pay attention to my sales numbers and they're gonna sell out my hardcover print run of that book. It's gonna eventually sell out, so if you want a hardcover of The Stars We Steal, pick it up because I don't think they're ever gonna print more of them. If there's gonna be another like edition, it'll be a paperback, so. And that's a good thing. Thank you for, you shock me always by buying my books. But, you know, it's just kind of the thing where you have to evaluate, okay, is their humble brag impressive or is their humble brag not impressive? It's just, it doesn't even matter. But it's just kind of funny because I've definitely seen authors post where I'm like, yeah, you got a second printing because your publisher didn't print many books in your first print run, but congratulations. Like, frankly, selling any books is amazing. And so that is to say, with my humble brag, Honestly, it's a really good sign that I'm getting a second printing. I didn't have a massive print run, but I didn't have a tiny print run, so thank you and I love you all. And someone did ask me in the comments, which was part of the reason why I was like, maybe I should make a video about print runs. Like, how many print runs do I need to have to earn out my advance? I don't know. There are calculations you can do to figure out how many copies you have to sell basically to earn out in advance, and I could do that, but I haven't, so I don't actually know how many copies I have to sell out to earn out my advance. So we'll just hope for the best. Now, first, what factors go into print runs? And then I'm gonna talk about how you as an author should feel about your print run, and also just some like tips and best practices from me related to print runs. So what factors into print run numbers? Like, what are the publishers thinking? So part of it is the importance of the title of the book to a publisher and whether or not they are a lead. Lead titles, important books, books that they plan to really focus their efforts on, they're just gonna have higher print runs. They're gonna announce a higher print run to try to drive that interest with the next group I'm gonna talk about, things that determine print runs. And it's also, it can be chicken and egg where they've decided it's their lead title, they're gonna print more copies of it, so they're gonna do more marketing because, well, now they printed copies of it and they need to get those copies out of the warehouse. So it's kind of a cycle. So ultimately a lot of this does come down to what the publisher wants, except, so the other things that factor into your print run, I have a list of kind of like, well, it's about making fetch happen. But before I get to making fetch happen, there's also factors of the genre that the book is in, as well as previous sales, either of comp titles for that genre for the publisher or for the author themselves. So genre, some genres just sell more. You're not gonna have like a massive and crazy and insane print run for say a historical or a sci-fi, because those tend not to move massive numbers, but fantasy titles, contemporary rom-coms, thrillers can definitely support bigger print runs because those are slightly more commercial genres, more likely to move more copies of those. It can also depend, like some genres, like this is less so for YA, but this can factor into other genres, have readership that really like ebooks. Like, so this is all talking about print runs and I'm not even talking about other formats, but I will tell you overwhelmingly, generally in YA, but I've certainly also seen the trends in my books, I just sell far more physical copies than I sell audiobooks or ebooks. The readership of what I write and what a lot of other people write, it's worth investing in those physical copies because people still like physical copies there. So they factor those sorts of things in, but there are genres more out of YA where you might sell a ton of ebooks and you maybe don't have to invest as heavily in physical copies. There are also cases where they might not go hard on the hardcover, knowing, well, we'll release the paperback in a year and this genre paperback tends to sell better. There's all this like stuff that publishers think about. So let's talk about making fetch happen. So a publisher can decide that they want a book to be the next big thing, but that doesn't always mean that that is actually what happens. So the next factor of how many copies do they actually print? So the sales team does their job, marketing does some early stuff, but it's really sales. And if they don't get the orders, they're not gonna print the copies. So bookstore orders, the bookstores, indies especially, the big ones you think of, Amazon, Books of Wonder, Barnes & Noble, some of the stores like Target, Costco, Walmart, like if you get those placements, they will put in their orders ahead of time with the sales team. And so, well, what will affect your print run? If you get an order from Target for 10,000 copies, that's obviously gonna affect your print run. If you get into a book box, this is where marketing is doing their job, you will have a larger print run because let's say you get Owl Crate, they're gonna have to print 15,000 books. It could be a special edition. Indie interest, like are any of the indies taking a lot of copies? Is that order big? How much is Barnes & Noble betting on this title? Is it a Barnes & Noble book club pick? And so on. There's also library orders. So how many copies is the school and library market really ordering? They also have so that's like downline, but also the publishers are pitching distributors, the big distributors like Ingram or Baker and Taylor, which serves the libraries. And it's like, well, how many orders are they going to take? How well do they think the title is going to perform? And then there's also, and what affects those can also be things like early buzz, trade reviews. So if the book is selected for any like a specific buzz list, say in Indie Next, that'll definitely impact your indie bookstore sales. Something like Junior Library Guild, that directly affects your sales because there are like automatic orders that come from that. If you get starred reviews from trades, libraries will most often increase their orders. Indies can as well because the different trades go to different audiences. And so all of this is kind of like they're doing their calculations behind the scenes. There's like the literal number of like, we definitely have enough orders for all of here, so that is the print run. But how much over do they want to do to account for, well, if they're getting this push and it starts to take off, we want to make sure we have enough copies in the warehouse going to the distribution centers to support sales for X number of months. And so all of that goes into the calculation of what is your print run. So that is the thing with my book where the publisher says, oh, it's selling faster than we thought it would. Not that they didn't think it would sell the copies, but it's going faster than they thought. So they have to resupply sooner than they thought. And that whole thing with things getting held up in China, they need to get me into a queue to do a second printing. And I'm just like, mind exploding. But it's honestly kind of cool. I think all like the stuff that they factor in and they have to deal with. Which brings me to like, should you worry about print runs? No, not really. So here's the thing, whether you have a massive first print run or a modest first print run or a small first print run, I mean, honestly, if you really don't want to stress, don't ask. They tend to, some of them might volunteer that information to you, but I've only had that information, I think, volunteered once, and then the other, I think, I might have even asked that time. That's the thing, I just ask. So you can ask too, or your agent can ask. Just ask your editor like a month out from pub, because once you get your final copies, you know they've definitely printed them, and you just ask, so what's my first print run? What's the size of my first print run? Or if you are a lucky duck, as I am now finally, some publishers have author portals where they actually put that information. So I now finally have an author portal. I had heard told of the magical author portal, and now I have the Penguin Random House author portal. And I love it. It is as good as I expected it to be, because it literally has an entire section. It doesn't tell me my print run. I got that number separately from my editor, but it shows me copies shipped. And actually, before my editor told me that I was getting a second print run, I could see that my orders between week 1 and 2 had increased by 1,000 copies, which meant that the bookstores, like from what I can tell, it was Barnes & Noble and Amazon primarily, like they'd increased their order, each of them increased their order by 500 copies, which I was like, well, that's gotta be a good sign. And since I knew my print run, I knew that they were very close to maxing my print run. And so I just love all this data, and it's really, really cool. But should you worry if, say, they tell you that your print run is 5,000 copies? No, because that's the beautiful thing. You can more easily sell out that print run, like, and exceed expectations for that print run and get another print run. And you can end up in exactly the same place, or honestly even surpass the sales of someone who maybe got a bigger print run than you did. But the difference is they're kind of a quiet disappointment to their publisher potentially. That sounds so terrible, but meaning, someone who got a larger print run than you, let's say someone got a 30,000 copy print run and you got a 10,000 copy print run, and you might initially be all sad because you're like, oh, they only printed 10,000 copies. Well, if you sell those 10,000 copies and then they do another print run and you sell those, but the 30,000 print run, they only sell about half the stock, you're doing pretty well, actually. And the other person isn't doing as well. They have backstock in the warehouse, and the publisher is like kind of panicking and or not happy about that. So everyone has their own different journey. Now, I'm not going to diminish your feelings. You're still gonna have feelings when you hear about your print run. Like, I definitely, when I ask, I'm always like, how big is the print run? And yet I also then rationally tell myself, like, don't over stress over your print run. And I did directly ask my friend who is the editor, I was like, does it really matter? Like, is it a bad sign if you have a small print run? And she said no. She said exactly what I've told you, that yeah, well, it can represent that there's kind of a lower risk that is being taken on the title. It honestly doesn't matter if you sell those copies. At the end of the day, sales matter far more than your print run. And it's just not worth kind of stressing over that print run. And yeah, I like to see the glass half full of this, which is, you know that it's less likely you're going to disappoint your publisher by having a ton of backstock in the warehouse, one, yay. And two, you get to humble brag on Twitter in the event that you go into a second or third printing, and that's kind of win-win-win. So that is kind of the basics of print runs. Basically, they're not as big as you think they are. It differs wildly, and like one author's kind of experience with a print run is going to be totally different from another author's experience. Different publishing houses and imprints have different kind of philosophies when it comes to like how much stock they're ordering and kind of what they do with it. And yeah, it's just this fun little nitty-gritty thing that authors get to deal with. But like that said, yeah, was it on my bucket list that I wanted to have a book that got a second printing? Yes, and I'm very happy to have accomplished that. So as much as I tell you, oh, like don't think about it too much, and it doesn't really matter, like we all have our like secret little dreams. It's kind of exciting to like sell out your print run, because you're like, you just go, I hope mommy and daddy really love me now. And yeah, I would love to know down below in the comments questions that you have about print runs, anything I don't know. I will just simply ask someone else and maybe I can answer your question. Or if you are also an industry person and you have fun little nuggets to talk about with print runs, down below in the comments, and give this video a thumbs up if you like it, and I will make more videos on the nitty-gritty of interesting, dry / opaque topics in traditional publishing. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do that. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.